There we go. Hello, everybody. I'm Simeon Bankoff, Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. This is HDC's Preservation School. This is actually our first online class, so please have some patience as we work through the intricacies of this. As you may know, the Historic Districts Council is the citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods. Yes, indeed, I do have a doppelganger. There are two of me here. We're the citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods. We work in three principal program areas: education, community outreach, and direct advocacy. Preservation School is one of our key programs, educational programs, where we hope to teach people some of the basic skills that you need in order to pursue community preservation efforts and interact with historic buildings. None of these are actual skills that anyone is born with, so we're bringing some experts to you to teach you them. This program is actually generously funded by the New York City Council, as well as the Department of Cultural Affairs and the New York State Council on the Arts. Additional classes in the Preservation School can be signed up on our website, www.htc.org. If you look under the events program or under the Preservation School, if you search for Preservation School, you will find previous classes of the Preservation School on video that we've saved so that you can see them there. I hope you will. You can also look on our YouTube page. We're going to be keeping just a bit of housekeeping, which is that we're going to be keeping everybody muted, except for, of course, our speaker. During the presentation, if you have questions, do please write them in the chat, and we will relay them. And then we will have, the presentation should be about 35 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end to answer any questions. Thank you all very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dan Allen. Dan is a preservation architect, a principal of CTA Architects, and the president of the Historic Districts Council. Dan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Simeon. And thanks, everybody. Mysterious group of strangers who have showed up. We're going to do the best we can. I want to start by saying that normally this discussion that we have is usually done around a table at HTC's headquarters, and around that table we have the opportunity to pass chunks of masonry, bits of sheet metal around, handle them, talk about them. We don't have that luxury here, so I'm going to do a little bit of holding things up, and we're going to rely a little bit more heavily on a series of what I'm old enough to call slides or images of New York City buildings. Our topic is traditional buildings, building materials. And so we're going to take a sort of very simplified top-down approach. I have no idea the level of expertise of the group that I'm talking to. So if it's too basic for you, I apologize. If it's not complex enough for you, I apologize. The great benefit, I think, to Zoom meetings is that you can leave if indeed, without being impolite at all, if indeed this is not your thing. So, but I hope it is your thing. And we're going to take a very informal top-down approach to talking about New York City buildings. And we're going to start with this lovely little building in the next neighborhood over from where I sit now. This is Sunnyside Gardens. This is a unique little house that's the Sunnyside Gardens Park Keeper's house. And we did a number of things to this house probably about 5 years ago that are a good starting point for what we want to talk about. What we're really going to be talking about this evening is a kind of make-do genius that makes up a lot of our historic buildings. A lot of the technology that we have today to deal with buildings wasn't available, thought of, wasn't possible at the time these buildings were built. And so a lot of what we're going to be looking at are systems that are really kind of pure genius in dealing with the natural world without a lot of fancy chemistry and without often a lot of fancy materials. They're very basic materials, a lot of them. A lot of them are very natural materials, most of them are. And it's really all in how they're put together that make them work and that make our city and most other American cities, but certainly our city, such an amazing place. It's almost, I think of it almost as a museum of American construction. Walking around New York is a grand opportunity to see all these things at work. And I hope that after this talk, we'll understand a little bit more and how they go together to make the fabric of our city. So let's start with the Sunnyside Garden Park Keeper's House. And the reason we're starting here is we're starting with really the daddy of all roofing materials in our culture, which is slate. So I'm going to do my first holding up. This is a slate. It's a gray slate from a building on the Upper West Side. This slate roof was replaced with a new slate roof. Let's go to the next slide, Michelle. That work? There we go. This is the slate roof in progress. To understand how slate roofing works, we have to first understand what the material is. It's a metamorphic stone, so it's laid down in beds, and then it is the result of a terrific amount of pressure, and it ends up forming a perfect natural tile or shingle, which works primarily by virtue of its pitch and its weight. So like a lot of the things we're going to be talking about, there doesn't need to be anything underneath this in terms of additional waterproofing. There are underlayments that serve a number of purposes, but basically the way a slate roof works is through a shingling action whereby each slate is successively covered. A significant portion of each slate is covered by the slate that's above it, so that each slate casts water down onto the next one. This actually is a good example. I don't know if you can see it, but here you can see the only part of this slate that was exposed because it was painted, which is not a good idea, is this lower part. Everything else above here was covered by other slate. And so anytime you see a slate roof, you're only seeing a very small fraction of the material as what's called exposure or exposure to the weather. So only a tiny fraction of the slate is actually doing the work, although all together as a system, it's doing the work to shed water. So what you're also seeing here are a couple of holes, and this is how the slate is attached. Good slaters will hang a slate and not nail it. That means that the nail head, which is typically a copper nail, should be driven just tight, but not too tight, so that if there's any flexure in the roof, the slate has a little bit of room to give. So like a lot of the roofing systems that we're going to talk about, the way this all works is based on pitch, based on the ability for a material to shed water onto its neighbor and to control water, and based, in this case, on weight. So only the tops of the slates are fastened. The rest of it depends on the fact that the slate, each successive layer of slate sitting on the next, is heavy enough to hold it down even in the high winds that we have in New York. So here is a good place to start. You're looking at the lower courses of the slate roof. Can we go back in the slide, Michelle? Back, there we go. One good thing to look at, you're seeing here the copper gutter at the base, and then the lower courses of slate, which have snow guards, which are also in this case made of sheet copper that are tucked in and fastened with the same nail that fastens the slate. But as we go up the roof, here is something to look at that's often a good giveaway as to whether you're looking at an original slate roof versus a slate roof that has been replaced by someone who doesn't know exactly what they're doing. So this slate roof, like most slate roofs, this is a new one, but we've used a technique here called graduating, which means that the exposure of the slate at the bottom of the roof, closest to the gutter, is greater than the exposure of the slate at the top. It's mostly a visual effect. It has some, it does some help in terms of shedding water up at the top of the roof to have the exposure decrease. But certainly if you walk around Sunnyside Gardens, where this building is, you'll see that a lot of the slate roofs, the original ones, are graduated, and it gives a rather nice appearance, a little bit of false perspective to the roof. And so it's not a simple flat gray surface. There's a lot that can be done with slate in terms of making it a visual component of the building. So this slate, for example, that I just showed you is scalloped, so it's got a special cut shape, but we can also use slate in patterns using red and gray and non-fading purple slate to make patterns on roofs. So it's like a lot of the things we'll be talking about this afternoon, or this evening, it's both a functional material, but as part of its function, it can be made quite beautiful and can be made an ornamental part of the building as well. Let's move on to the next slide. I think we can probably go to. So there it is up close, and there it is at the base of it coming up against the chimney, which leads us rather nicely into our next roofing material. So here we are coming up around the base of the chimney, and what you're seeing there is a starter course of slate at the very bottom, so we just see a little bit of exposure, and then the regular exposure of the slate starts thereafter. But if you think about the fact that what you're really seeing there is probably at any given point 2 or 3 layers of slate, if you were to drill through it, you get an idea of how heavy this roof is and how it depends upon something that we talk a lot about in historic materials, which is redundancy. It depends on the fact that the thing that you're looking at is not the only thing that's there to shed water, to keep you warm, or to keep you dry. So this transitions nicely to some copper flashing around the chimney and a copper flat seam roof. So we're going to talk a little bit about copper roofing. The flat seam roof that you're seeing here is over the what was originally the back porch of the park keeper's house. It's now part of a 2-bedroom apartment, and it looks out over the kiddie pool in Sunnyside. The reason it's a flat seamed roof and is done in these squares with interlocking lock joints and solder is that the pitch of that roof is too shallow. It's too flat for us to use any of the other technology of copper roofing that we use so successfully in other more steeply pitched applications. So that's a fairly simple roof. It looks simple. It's actually among the most labor-intensive roofs to put down. As you can imagine, each panel of copper is fitted with a hook on the end, and they're each interlocked, dressed down, and then each one has to be separately soldered. So this is not an inexpensive roof. It's one that we use only usually on very small areas and on areas that are too flat, that don't have the pitch to shed water in the way that other copper roofing assemblies do. So let's move on and look at some of those. This is a terrific building. This is Grace Church in Brooklyn Heights, and we're in the middle of putting on a batten seam roof here. So this is really a good place to start in understanding how copper roofing works. Copper is a ubiquitous material in New York City historic building. It's natural material. We typically use it in roofing in sheets. Copper has one of these wonderful archaic forms of measurement. It's measured in ounces per square yard, which is wonderful if you want to confuse people. So we very often use for flashing 16-ounce copper, but we may upgrade to a 24-ounce copper to get a thicker, more durable material. It is naturally very durable in our environment because it tends to form its own semi-self-protective patina. If you think about the Statue of Liberty and other copper-based things that have been outdoors in a long time, they turn a wonderful green, verdigris. And that really is the copper reacting mostly with sulfur dioxide and acid rain to form a slightly protective skin, and it turns that wonderful color. Here, the copper is pretty much brand new. It's red, it's shiny, and it's being put together in a very traditional, with a very traditional method called the batten seam. Let's go to the next slide. So here's how the batten seam works. Each pan of the roof is laid down and butted up against a wooden batten. That's what the batten of the batten seam comes from. And then the battens are each capped off with a separate piece of copper. This, like standing seam roofing, which you'll see a lot of in New York City, relies on an understanding of the material that's really kind of a basic genius. It goes back to some of this very traditional design. The idea here is that a copper sheet roof can never be held entirely in place. It can only be held down. It must be allowed as a natural material to move, to expand with heat, and to contract with cold. And so what we're doing here is basically holding the pans in place and creating a profile that will direct and shed the water. Again, we're not using any fancy modern chemistry. We're not using any goop, so to speak. We're not sealing anything. About the most modern thing we're using here is an engineered underlayment, which would take the place of pretty much rosin paper, which we would use in a more traditional copper roof. This actually is an insulated roof using insulation board, which has been a great benefit to the church that used to just hemorrhage money every winter in terms of heating. If you ever are in Brooklyn Heights, poke your head in this church. We did this in conjunction with Leo Blackman Architects and Evergreen Architectural, who did a tremendously beautiful job on the interior, where there's a gorgeous Victorian sunburst pattern on the ceiling, which which was brought back by the restoration, which this copper roof now protects. So the idea here is we're using a natural material, we're not sealing it in any way, we're not pinning it entirely in place, we're just holding it down and allowing for it to move. But within that movement is enough play so that it remains watertight, so it continues to direct water and shed water. I'm gonna hold up a pan here. I hope people can see this. This is actually part of a standing seam roof pan, but the concept is similar. Each end of the piece is fitted or bent so to allow it to be crimped and rolled over to create standing or vertical seams. In the case of the batten seam, there's a piece of wood in there that creates a thicker, about 1.25 inches wide seam, upstanding leg. In the case of standing seam, when you look around, you'll see a lot of standing seam in New York. It really is just a thin upstanding leg. You'll also see that the cross joints, which you can see going in place here, are also staggered. Everything is being done here to maximize the traditional material, to make sure that it directs water, doesn't allow water to go side to side, but instead takes advantage of the very, very steep pitch of this roof and sends the water directly down to the gutter and away into the drains. Let's go to the next slide. So here it is going together, and you can see at the bottom the covers have been put on, and they're all cleated or held down, but again, nothing is pinned in place with nails, because then the roof, as it expands and contracts, would tear itself apart. We want to hold that roof down, but we don't want to try and interfere with its natural desire, the material's natural desire to get bigger and smaller. Because when we think about a roof in particular, in our climate, here in New York City, we can get up into the hundreds of degrees on a hot day on a south-facing roof, and then we can go right back down into the 40s Fahrenheit, and then down, obviously, freezing and below. So we deal here in New York City with a terrific range of temperatures. And the traditional designs that work well here are such that they can handle that kind of very, very large temperature swing. Other places in the world, you go, for example, to South Carolina and places where they can use less robust roofing, not South Carolina, it's a bad example because of the hurricanes, but I'm thinking of other places in the South that can use less robust roofing, less robust masonry materials, because their climate simply isn't as difficult as ours. New York is a really tough climate. Let's go to the next slide. So here it is going together. This is after a little bit of snow. But this gives you an idea of how each of the joints are configured so that without the use of any caulking or sealant or goop of any kind, we're using the configuration of the material, the design of the material, and its pitch, which is of paramount importance here, to shed water. And this roof works quite beautifully today, and it will for 7 to 100 years with proper maintenance. Let's keep going. Here's a close-up of a small ornamental roof that's between the church and the rectory, or actually it's the church hall. And here you see one of the nice things about using copper roofing is that it ties in very well with another use of copper, which is copper flashing. We can take the sheet metal and we can make very good transitions between the roof and the masonry surfaces. Here you see on the lower end of the photograph, a masonry tucked into a reglet, which is a slot that we've cut in the masonry and tucked the copper into that as a way of making the transition from the roof to the wall surface. Let's move on. There it is. We also, again, we try not to use a lot of solder, but in some cases we can. So solder is a mixture of tin and lead that can be used and heated up along with the copper, much the same way that we solder copper pipes. We can do that with roofing and with flashing. Let's move on. Here's that flat seam roof again, and you can see how labor intensive this all would be to put something like that down. But you can also see exactly why we would do that here versus putting a standing seam or a batten seam roof on here. It's simply too flat. It was never designed to receive a batten seam or a standing seam roof, which would require much greater pitch. Slate, which is here under that blue tarp, which we saw earlier, that has plenty of pitch and that's doing nicely. Let's keep moving, Michelle. Wood. Now, I don't talk a lot about wood. Most of my career has been spent working on buildings in New York City. We have some wood buildings. We more typically have wood components. So this is, for example, a cornice in brownstone, Brooklyn. A lot of these cornices are made of wood. We need to keep our eye on them. At a certain point, all of the putty and patch it up techniques don't work, and we simply have to carve a new piece and replace it. I think that's what happened here. Let's move on, Michelle. There it is from the side. And so you can see here it's been built up, the carved element applied to the front. And so our option here really probably is just to replace it. If it had been not quite so far gone, we might have been able to consolidate it. But we have to pay attention. There's a lot of wood windows, and we do have some wood houses and some wood siding, throughout the 5 boroughs. Let's go to the next one. This is a material that's dear to my heart, and it's sheet metal. So copper is a sheet metal. This is actually another type of sheet metal. This is actually galvanized sheet metal, or sometimes referred to as tin, although not technically tin. This is the cornice of 395 Broadway, which if you're ever walking around in Tribeca is about a block below Canal Street at the corner of Walker and Broadway. And it's a 1901 Meineke building with a tremendous sheet metal cornice. And it's, to me, a great example of a New York architect who wants a lot of bang for his buck. He really wants to get that visual interest. And so he creates this huge, huge cornice, imposing cornice at the top of a very nice limestone building. But for one reason or another, he chooses to use a substitute material. And in this case, he's used formed sheet metal to get this terrific cornice. This thing is huge, and we'll go and show you a couple of pictures of it. Let's go ahead, Michelle. So here it is after some restoration in conjunction with the Landmarks Preservation Commission and choice of color, which is very similar to the limestone. To get an idea of how big this wonderful thing is, those Medallion brackets, which are the curlicued underside brackets that you see, are probably big enough. They were big enough for a good-sized child to take a bath in. This is not a small thing. It sticks out about 8-9 feet out over Broadway. Let's keep going. To get an idea how this thing is put together, we went inside. Here we are with some wonderful Polish mechanics from West New York Restoration back in, this is right around 2001. And here we are examining the inside of the cornice. We ended up putting a personnel hatch on this cornice to allow people to get inside it on a regular basis and inspect it. But you can see it's basically all theater, which is one of my favorite things about New York architecture, is that sometimes the thing you look up and see as an imposing part of the building is in fact a piece of theater, a piece of substitution. This thing is less than 1/8 of an inch thick, or maybe 1/8 of an inch thick tops. It's all sheet metal, all bent, and all fastened back with various fasteners to a steel frame. Let's go to the next slide. And the steel frame is beautifully pocketed into a great big 1901 masonry wall that keeps the whole thing from cascading over into Broadway. So one good thing to look at when you're looking at New York City buildings is to realize that not everything is as it appears. Not everything that you think is stone is stone. Some things are substitute materials, but some of them are really a kind of genius of substitute materials. And to me, pressed sheet metal is exactly that. Let's keep moving. We've got a couple more examples. So here is a part of a cornice from a building in Soho, a little bit blurry, I apologize. But here is a new piece being made. It's on the sidewalk shed, actually. And you can see the level of detail that we can get by folding and pressing the sheet metal. This is galvanized sheet metal, which will be painted. Let's keep going. This is zinc-coated copper being used in a similar way. This is a 36 Gramercy, I believe. So here we're using very nice sheet metal material with a beautifully bent profile to clad some bay windows. Let's keep going. There's a close-up of that, so you can see that a lot of what you're looking at the top of cast iron buildings in Soho is not in fact cast iron. It's made a neat transition to being a sheet metal cornice, and the fact that both the cast iron and the sheet metal are painted often with exactly the same color and the same finish, it gives this sort of wonderful effect of the building all being of a piece. And I think we have a picture of that. Michelle? So here is the top of 32 Green Street, conveniently labeled with its year of construction at 1873. This is a new cornice that we fabricated in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. But what's good about this is that you see those little donut-like things that are right at the base. That's the end, about the end of the cast iron. Everything above that is sheet metal. And you really, obviously you can tell the difference by the detail and the projection of the sheet metal. But otherwise, the paint finish is the same, and it always was. And that's one of the things that makes these buildings so remarkable and of such a piece. So here's sheet metal being used to obtain a terrific amount of visual interest without really adding really negligible weight to the building, and a very easy material to support. So look up and enjoy sheet metal. It's a wonderful thing. And once you're sensitized to it, you see it in copper, uncoated. You very often see it painted. Sometimes these were actually painted with sand paint to give them an even more of the appearance of stone. Although this one isn't fooling anybody. It's just a wonderful piece of sheet metal. Let's move on. Brownstone, which is a painful topic for those of us involved in the restoration and preservation world. New York has a lot of brownstone. This is a piece, hold it up, this is actually rather nice brownstone. This is from the middle of Massachusetts. This is Henry Hobson Richardson's favorite brownstone, East Longmeadow. That's a pretty good brownstone. Unfortunately, New York is not made mostly out of that. It's mostly made out of Portland, Connecticut brownstone and Belleville, New Jersey brownstone, which are not as good. They're not as tight grained. But let's talk about brownstone very briefly. I think I'm doing okay for time. It is a sedimentary stone, a lot of clay in it. It has some wonderful pluses, and it's got some terrible minuses. The pluses are, it is a beautiful deep brown color, often with flecks of mica. It is a wonderful stone to cut and carve. It takes detail. It's a free stone. We can carve it in any direction. It takes detail beautifully and holds it as long as it can hold anything. It's relatively lightweight. It bonds well to mortar. Probably the biggest advantage of it from a practical standpoint here in New York City was it was damn easy to get our hands on. In the latter half of the 19th century, it was quarried in two places that were easily accessible by water. So you take your barge up to Portland, Connecticut, right by the Connecticut River. You load it up with brownstone, you sail it down through the Hell Gate, and you unload it and you build a city out of it. Also aesthetically very popular in what often referred to as the brown decades. The downsides, of course there are downsides. Let's move to the next slide. This is the open work at the end of Grace Church. This is before the project. You can actually get an idea of the roof we replaced at Grace Church, which is this horrendous asphalt shingle roof. But there it is, nice detail, holding up well. We actually had to dismantle this and put it back together to fully flash the roof. Let's move on. We get to the problem with brownstone. And one of the reasons we see very little original brownstone still at the surface, seeing the light of day. A lot of it is actually pigmented stucco that people have put on and repaired and resurfaced, because the material is it's famously bad in terms of how it survives in our climate. It has a problem which exhibits itself by what's called exfoliation. And you can see here on this brownstone, I think in Fort Greene, you can see exfoliation is exactly what it sounds like. The skin of the stone is coming off in layers. It has to do with the way the stone was put down in beds when it was being formed. It's just as bad when it comes off. So this soft stone exfoliates, flakes off, and creates this terrible condition, which has led to all of this resurfacing. So it's one of the great tragedies of a building material when it's in good shape, and often it's inexplicably in good shape. Sometimes within the same facade, a piece of brownstone will be in perfectly great shape and other pieces surrounding it will be in terrible shape. It is beautiful. So you can understand the lure of it, but we involved in the restoration industry have been saddled with it for about 100 and something years, a little more than that. Let's move on. Limestone, on the other hand, is a great material. It's not local to New York. What is local to New York is a metamarble called Tuckahoe Stone. I don't know if you can see this. It has gone partway to being a marble. This is a broken piece, and you can, I don't know if you can see in this wonderful medium that is zoom, the sparkle to it. It's a glorious calcareous stone. There it is with a little bit of time-worn pigment patina on it. Limestone comes into fashion in the 19th century as a better material. It is indeed a better material. It's calcareous stone, which means it's made up of the shells and the bones of little aquatic animals that are also laid down in beds, but it does not have anywhere near the problems that brownstone does. It tends to be used in New York City for higher style buildings. This is 18 East 82nd Street, I believe, or 83rd Street. This is a house from 1901, which was sorely vandalized just before the designation of the Metropolitan Museum of Art Historic District. The baluster that you see there is new, made of new limestone, as is the top floor. Someone had actually decided in, we think, the early 70s to build out the bow front all the way to the top using buff colored brick. The before pictures are truly horrific, but we had enough information to rebuild the top, and we're using new cut limestone. It's worked out quite well. Limestone is a beautiful material. A lot of our favorite buildings in New York are made out of it. A lot of institutional buildings. It cleans very well. It has a few downsides in that it is acid sensitive, but it tends to last a little bit better than brownstone. Let's take a look at the next slides. I think we've got some details. So here's that balustrade and the new limestone, and you can see it takes detail beautifully. Let's go one more. There's the Metropolitan Museum in the background. There's the new versus the old. So they left us, the Vandals from the 1970s left us at least the end blocks of the top floor, which we were able to bring back. This is before the final cleaning. Let's keep going. And there's some of the detail. It just takes detail beautifully, and that's one of the reasons it became highly sought after. Mostly this comes from the middle of the United States. Indiana, of course, famous for its limestone. So a lot of this stuff had to come by train or by barge in order to be used in New York City. So it's not as easy to get, costs a little bit more, but from a longevity standpoint, in many ways, it's worth it. Let's keep going. Granite, I don't have very many granite slides. This is main granite that's at the base of 36 Gramercy. We'll see a lot more of that when we talk about terracotta in a few minutes. Granite is a wonderful, very, very durable material. It's an igneous rock, so it's fire formed. Here is a little piece, I don't know if you can see it, of granite from Stony Creek, which is on the shores of Long Island Sound in Stony Creek, Connecticut, just north and east of New Haven. It was Charles Fallon McKim's favorite granite, so if you weep for Penn Station, weep for the fact that much of it was this glorious pink granite with this wonderful speckle and sparkle to it. It is terrifically acid insensitive, which is great for us. It's very hard. It takes detail beautifully. It's harder to work with, but it tends to last very, very well in our environment. It's fun sometimes to think about how well it lasts versus some of the other stones that we see. If you ever take a walk in, say, Calvary Cemetery here in Queens, you can easily spot the marble and the stones from the granite stones. The granite stones are the ones that are lasting, and the marble ones are the ones that are sugaring away to nothing. So it's a terrific material, mostly from the Northeast, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, of course, the granite state of New Hampshire, and a lot of stuff like this from Maine. Let's keep going. There it is up close. So you can see there are lots of different types of granite of all different types of grain. We're working with some now at the, we will be soon at the Staten Island Courthouse on Richmond Terrace. We're using very, very fine grain from New England there. But there are granites that are deep red, granites that are pale white, just a wonderful material and a very, very, very durable material in our environment. A lot of our great buildings are made out of this. Let's move on. So there's is up close. Of course, architects never take pictures when things are going right. Here's a picture of something that's gone wrong, and there's a separation between the two pieces, but it's a nice shot of how that granite looks in service. How are we on time? Let's move on because we're running out of time. This is a lead into probably my favorite material. It's what I teach at Columbia. It's architectural terracotta. This is 36 Gramercy Park East. obviously on Gramercy Park. It's a white glazed terracotta building from about 1912. It's the work of James Riley Gordon, a remarkable man whose archives are at the University of Texas at Austin. Let's move on. There we are, sound testing terracotta. So terracotta is a ubiquitous material in New York. It incredibly popular the latter half of the 19th century and into the first half of the 20th century, right up until about World War II, with some sporadic survivors after that. But here we're looking at a grotesque that's sticking out over the sidewalk, and we're sound testing it with a hammer, which is how we typically look at terracotta, because terracotta often has problems that are created by the steel or iron anchorage that's inside the units, not so much by the terracotta itself. So here we're dealing with a clay, a fired clay material. It's clay and pre-fired clay material, either unglazed, slip-coated, which means a coating of another matte, usually matte, liquid clay, or glazed. In this case, there's a vitreous glaze on it, which is something akin to a piece of chinaware or a piece of plumbing, toilet bowl, sink. Let's keep moving. So here we are sound testing. These ended up being replaced with new pieces to match. Let's keep going. Here we are up close, and I don't know in Zoom if you can see this, but this is a little putai's head, little baby. This building has tremendous numbers of babies with bare feet. And what you're looking at here is the top of the baby's head. And the classic thing that is a dead giveaway that you're looking at glazed terracotta, which is craquelure, which is this fine spiderweb pattern of micro cracks, which has to do with the fact that the clay that the body is made out of is perpetually expanding ever so slightly, and the vitreous or glassy glaze can't do that. So it fractures ever so slightly. Usually not a problem, and in some cases it can be quite attractive. Let's keep going. So here we are looking at more of that. Let's go ahead. Here's how it's made. So this is a shot of the pressing room at Boston Valley Terracotta outside of Buffalo. Terracotta, most terracotta that we see on buildings, without going into too much detail, is still made in much the same way as it was in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Here it's been pressed. The terracotta manufacturer takes advantage of the fact that there's a natural disassociation, disaffinity, if you will, between the wet or uncured clay and the plaster of the mold. So these are pottery plaster molds, and the person who has pressed it has whacked that clay in and built up walls and pressed the clay hard against the plaster to get as tight a connection as possible. The plaster will suck a little bit of water out of the clay and it will naturally release. So unlike a lot of the castings that we do with, say, concrete, we don't have to use a release agent here. And it's one of the reasons that we can get the kind of incredible detail. If you think of a Louis Sullivan building with just incredible fine detail done in the terracotta, it's because of this wonderful natural disaffinity between the plaster and the clay. It allows us to push the limit in terms of detailing, and the clay, once it sets up a little bit, starts to harden, takes that detail and holds it beautifully. And then if properly fired, then it becomes a vitreous material that is tremendously durable in our environment, not to mention the plus of being able to add right into the process a very permanent form of glaze, or the color of the clay, or a color of the slip coating. A lot of what we see in New York is actually terracotta that's meant to look like limestone. Typical New York cocktail of a building from, say, 1926 would be natural stone up to the third floor, and then all the trim, anything that's not brick above that, is often architectural terracotta. So look up. You can usually see the difference because the stone actually weathers differently than the terracotta. Let's keep moving. So there's another shot of those molds. It's a labor-intensive process. Once the clay is tipped out of the molds and allowed to dry completely, it can then be glazed or left unglazed or slip-coated and then fired, just like we would fire any other ceramic. Terrific material. So here you can see the molds all band clamped together. There are other ways of making terracotta, but we don't have time to talk about it. But there are other lectures you can find that do that, some of them even by me. So let's move on, Michelle. So here's this young man, and he's actually he's throwing some red terracotta into the mold. It's hard work. and it requires a fair amount of oomph to do it properly. What he wants to get is he wants to smash that clay just as tight as he can against the face of the plaster to get the best connection possible, to take the detail from the plaster mold and transfer it to the clay. So he's actually, at this point in the early stages of pressing, he's actually throwing lumps of clay in against the plaster. Let's keep moving. There's one of those grotesques from Gramercy that's about to be reproduced. We can do a lot of work now with some new technology like laser cutters. So for example, the plinth that he's sitting on was actually reproduced by using a laser scan, but there's really no substitution for the sculptor that actually makes the piece. Let's move on. And there he is at work. So you can see he's got the original and he's working. He's got the computer generated plinth down at the bottom, but he's working in wet clay to create a positive. Now he has to create the positive larger, 1 inch larger per foot, to allow for the fact that this material, in order to get back down to the correct size, will have to go through drying shrinkage first and then firing shrinkage. So terracotta is a tricky material, and there's an added step that always adds cost when we have to make a new positive that is 1/12 larger approximately. Let's move on. Here's a new plaster positive for the same 36 Gramercy. So a mold will be made from this that will then receive the clay. The clay will be tipped out of the mold and then fired. Let's keep moving. Here are some samples out of the kiln, done with their glazing. You can see the part that's going to be exposed to the weather is glazed. The part that's going to be hidden in the mortar joint, you can see is unglazed. So that's the natural color of the Boston Valley terracotta body. It's very simple, buff, colored largely ball clays. And there's a beautiful white glaze, and what we're doing is we're checking to see that the sample that's been approved by us and the Landmarks Commission matches the glaze, because there are all sorts of things that can happen in the process. What you're seeing in the background there are some extruded terracotta fins done in an unglazed red terracotta. So we can actually also press it out, almost akin to pressing dough through a pasta machine, and create shapes that way. But all the pieces that we're dealing with here are hand pressed. Here's a piece of terracotta from about 1912, and it's not glazed. It's a chunk from the inboard face. And what you can see, and if you look at most pieces of pressed terracotta, if you flip them over and look at the back of them, you'll see the finger marks of the people that pressed them back in the early part of the 20th century. So it's a wonderful, we could talk for hours about terracotta. It's a wonderful handmade, but somehow handmade and mass-produced material. Let's keep moving. Brick makes up a great deal of New York. Brick really is, if you think about it, is really a lot of what New York is composed of. Again, it's a question of something that's very simple, very inexpensive, very local, but can be used quite beautifully. This is the corner of the American Youth Hospital building, which is from oldest part is from 1892 by Richard Morris Hunt. And here he's using a very, very fancy brick from the 1890s, and he's using it in a way to create a beautiful, smooth, very high style finish on it. Let's take a look at the next one. This is how he's doing it. He's using something that's sometimes referred to as Philadelphia or stretcher bond. And what he wants is he wants a smooth surface that doesn't show any headers. A header is when we take a brick and we turn it in to help tie the thicknesses or widths of brick together. So here, he's specified this type of bond, and the mason is doing a lot of extra work to chop out little bits of the brick to hold the thing together, but to still have the appearance on the exterior of only stretchers, only bricks that are on their long side. So this is clearly a very high style building, a lot of effort being put in. Let's keep moving. Here it is. You can see there are closers. But you can also see how tight those mortar joints are. It's a truly wonderful building. If you're walking around uptown, it's at 104th and Amsterdam. We did the slate roof, the turrets, we rebuilt the dormers. A lot of good copper metal work there, but that's zinc coated copper. A lot of brownstone work. But here, the star really up at the bulk of this building is this beautiful, smooth, very high fired red brick surface. Let's keep moving. Other types of brick, we have a lot of wonderful buff brick in New York. This is a building that's now called the Casp Gilbert. It's by Casp Gilbert. It's late in his life from the 1920s. It was a store. Wonderful building at 130 West, 30th Street. Truly wonderful. Great terracotta. Here we are matching the mortar. So the thing to remember about working with brick is that everything we do with brick is an optical mixture that depends both on the appearance of the brick, but also on the mortar, the color of the mortar, the texture of the mortar, and the tooling of the mortar has a lot to do with whether it looks the way we want it to, or it matches what we might be matching. So here we are going through a sample process and obviously rejecting some of these and being happier with others. Let's keep moving. There it is. So here, again, going through a sample process, trying to match a weathered mortar, but you can see how the feel of the wall really changes at areas that have been previously repointed and at areas that have been allowed to weather. Let's keep going. Casp Stone. This is the Village East Cinema. It was the Jaffe Art Theater. It's the Yiddish Theater at 2nd Avenue and 12th Street. We don't have a lot of cast stone in New York. A lot of cast stone tends to be a little bit later than terracotta. It was often used when the budget did not permit using real terracotta. So it's basically, in this case, it's pigmented concrete that's put in molds and casts. And this was a building that was built, I've always felt, on a budget, but it is a wonderful building. And here the pigment in the concrete is integral, so it gives it this wonderful, warm, peachy tone to it that's still visible at 2nd Avenue and 12th Street. Let's keep moving. There it is up close. So you can see you can get a good level of detail. That's most of those pieces, they're original and simply cleaned. Built for the star of the Yiddish theater, a man named Schwartz, back in 1926. Still a wonderful place to go see a movie if we ever get to go see movies again, which I hope we do. Let's keep moving. Cast iron, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I think I'm running low on time. This is a before picture of what was the Bowery Lane Theater. It's now referred to as 54 Bond Street. It's right at Bond and Bowery. It's a remarkable cast iron building. Cast iron, very popular in New York construction, in mercantile construction, from about the 1850s on to before the turn of the 20th century. We still have some cast iron surviving, mostly as infill into the 20th century. But here we can make a building that is relatively fireproof, although it has a number of problems in a serious fire, which we're not going to go into, that we can make really as ornate as we want to by using this material. So it's gray iron and it's cast into molds similar to the way that we press the terracotta. And then it's all bolted together. So let's take a look at the next slide. So here it is finished and cleaned up and painted. It takes paint beautifully. This actually is 32 Green Street. We saw the sheet metal cornice before that. You can see the level of detail that's possible here. So those are wood windows set within cast iron surrounds. And to me, the most amazing thing about cast iron is that it can make a transition even within the same piece from being something that is almost purely functional to being something that's almost purely decorative. So let's look at some slides of that. Here's the base of that. You can see what happens to it. All of these are little pieces of cast iron because they have to be cast. So they can't be made in very large pieces. And they're all bolted one to another with little screws. And typically either two bolts, or very often the cast iron itself is tapped to form a receptor of the screw. Let's keep going. So there you see those little screw holes. Those are screw heads. Every cast iron building in New York is put together pretty much the same way. It's all fastened to itself, or frequently in this case, there is a brick backup to this. But you can see the level of detail that's possible here. It's really quite wonderful. This is why Margot Gale urged people to carry magnets around, and we still do, because to be sure what you're looking at is a cast iron, all you have to do is put a magnet on it. If it sticks, the chances are very good that it is. So here it is before restoration and painting. But you can see how that all goes together really quite ingeniously, using really just the cast iron itself and small screws. This is what, of course, is the problem in a fire. The screws tend to shear. But let's keep moving. So here it is. So that one piece of cast iron is being used, the gray part that you see on the left is used strictly for support, but then it bursts out into the plinth of a column. Same material, but where it's beautiful, it's intended to be beautiful, it can be made beautiful. Where it's intended to simply be structure, it can be structure. It has its limitations, but it is a remarkable material. You see the screw holes on the front of that sill. You can also see how this all goes together. It's a kind of genius of self-flashing in that typically the facades fit together to the point where they protect themselves and shed water as well, almost in a self-flashing way. Let's keep moving. There we are, same idea there. So we have some utilitarian and some ornamental cast iron, and it really, you can't tell where one stops and the other begins. Let's keep moving. These are pieces, replacement pieces. So you can see an idea of how mass-produced these buildings can be. The pieces can be repetitive. They're typically cast into sand molds. And here a great deal of detail can be obtained at a relatively low cost. And then all simply bolted together to create these wonderful confections of buildings, which then all become painted, get painted, and lead to things like the wonderful streets that we have in Tribeca and Soho, and here in NoHo. Let's keep moving. Wood windows, I don't think I need to stress the importance of how windows can make or break the appearance of a facade. These are replacement wood windows that we did for the Cherokee Apartments, very far east on 77th and 78th Street, as far east as you can go. These were originally the Shively sanitary tenements, and if you look at the windows that are closest to us, the large windows, those are actually triple hung windows, which means they have 3 sash. And the idea here was to get as much light and air into the small apartments as possible, because these apartments were built with for families with tuberculosis. So if you open those bottom 2 sash, they open to the point where an average sized person can stand up upright before hitting their head on the top sash. And there are sleeping porches that you can actually walk out on through these things. They're truly remarkable windows. Let's keep moving. I think we have some close-up shots. So there's one from the inside, this done in mahogany, all done with brass hardware. These windows are eminently maintainable, properly painted, and cared for. All the parts can be replaced if necessary. They should last a very long time. And they are a breeze to operate, because you can see that they're lifted by counterweights on that weight and chain, which is by far the best way to open and close a double hung window. Let's keep moving. I think we're coming to the end here. There's a detailed shot of the outside, just beautifully detailed. These windows actually came from a manufacturer in Ireland who pretty much went back into business to do this work for us. They all came over on containers and were put in probably about 5 years ago or so now. So wood windows, extremely important component of our buildings here in New York. Let's keep moving. We finished with stained glass. There are lots of other materials we could talk about, but in an hour, this is about all we can get in. This is the top of the dome at the East Midwood Jewish Center on Ocean Avenue in East Midwood, Brooklyn. This dome was entirely re-leaded and put back in. It's underneath a brand new skylight, which is also made of copper and glass, and it lights the interior of the dome. It's probably the most seductive material that we work with. This is a piece, for example, of, someone told me when I did this earlier, that looked like a sponge. But this is a piece of opalescent glass from one of the manufacturers in the middle of America. We still use this stuff. Stained glass is a beautiful, fragile material. It's held together with lead. So those separators that you see are what are referred to as cames, and the glass is set within those. Cames are dressed down and then puttied. Not much to say about this other than the fact that it's a terrific material to work with, and it's something to pay attention to. It was in the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. That's true. Let's go to the last slide, I think. Yes, if you apparently if you watch this television program called The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, this is where she goes to temple. But there's the effect of the glass on the interior of the space, and it is one of the most wonderful things we have available to us, and a truly great material to work with. So I hear people in my neighborhood banging pots and pans. So that means it's 7 o'clock. And I think I've used the entire hour. Simeon and Michelle, do we want to do any questions?
If there are any, if anyone has any questions, do please put them in the
Or
chat.
has everybody already left?
No, we still have
James Rosello.
19. I've got a question here from oh, actually, you can see it yourself,
I can, but I
it's in the
didn't get
chat
the end
from
of the
James.
question. What's the end of the question?
For replacing Tuckahoe marble, what are the good substitutes besides Georgia marble? Can you repeat the granite that was used? That was McKim's favorite used
Okay.
at Penn Station.
Georgia marble is probably our go-to. It's not perfect. Some people a number of years ago did buy, I think, the end of a golf course up in Tuckahoe, and they were taking some Tuckahoe Stone. That may be an apocryphal story. It's a very funny material. It's hard to match. Some of the Georgia marbles are about the best we have. So yes, that would be about it, James. And the granite is absolutely worth going to visit. It's from Stony Creek, Connecticut, and it's right along the Connecticut side of the Long Island Sound, maybe about 10 minutes further along I-95 from New Haven. It's actually, there are signs for it, Stony Creek, and you can probably sneak into the quarry and take a look. It's still a functioning quarry. It goes from the Stony with a Y. From the middle of the 19th century on, it's been a functioning quarry. It still is. Beautiful stone. If you look, James and everybody else, at the relatively recently completed seat wall that wraps around the north side of Battery Park on your way to Pier A, that's Stony Creek granite and a very nice use for it. Anything else? No problem, James. This is a very odd way to communicate.
Okay. It's a terribly weird way of communicating.
It is. So but let me thank everybody
you all
for coming. And
thank you, Dan, for a great presentation.
all right. Well, good night, everybody, and be well.